With Halloween fast approaching and time for a quick project, I turned to my Halloween past costumes for inspiration. Here we have Hermione circa 2003, 2004, 2012, and 2018. And I think it's time for an upgrade. Let's start with fabric choices. I got 5 yards of Burnley and Trowbridge black wool serge and 3 yards of burgundy cotton sateen from fabric.com. Now some references to create a pattern from. Ideally, I wanted this to look straight out of the movies, or at least as good as the $175 ones from Universal Studios. The robes were pretty consistent after the Chamber of Secrets, so that's the look that we're going for. I definitely want those large sleeves. I want the colored collar that will close with buttons, and of course, a pointed hood. And these look like they fit closer to the head than I thought they would be. They're not super large. And the length seems to vary from floor length to mid-calf, so I'm not too worried about it. I found this photo which really helped me a lot, and it made me realize I definitely need wand pockets for sure, and that it's not fully lined in the accent color, just a facing. I'm not going to do a black lining because my wool fabric is already quite heavy. This is where I pretend I know what I'm doing, even though I've never made a pattern from scratch before. So I'm going to try and keep this simple. The front sides will slightly flare at the bottom, and they'll have an indent to go around the neck at the top. The arm's eye shape is really just a guess. You will see how well that goes for me. Then with the shape, I assigned measurements I took from myself. 50 inches for the length, and then I took pretty precise measurements around the chest because I didn't want it to be a big baggy sack in the end. I wanted it to be kind of fitted at the top. Once I decided these measurements, I was able to draw it out on my Christmas wrapping paper that works as my pattern paper. The back is a similar shape to the front, but with a divot in the back of the neck and a more flared bottom. It will be cut on the fold along that right straight side so that the back will all be one piece. And again, I'm just sort of guessing on that arm's eye shape and taking measurements on myself to decide how wide the back should be under the arm and how wide the back should be to go towards the arm's eye. And I wanted to make sure the arm was also the same width down. And then I cut that one out of my wrapping paper. For sleeves, I googled a bishop sleeve shape to start with and tried to imitate it. I used a tape measure looped around my hand to try to visualize how big of a sleeve I wanted. Out of laziness of not wanting to make a mock-up, a mock-up would waste so much fabric in this design. The length of the top should be at least as much as the total arm's eye length off of the other two pieces. So when I was drawing it out on my pattern paper, I actually measured that out, and I guesstimated 23 inches here. Also important that the long sides that will be sewn together are the same length and meet up at the same point. So when you fold your pattern over, they should meet. Now this was the trickiest part for me. It was hard to visualize what a hood with a collar piece would look like when it was flat. So the bottom part needs to match up to the places on the front and the back where it will attach, which is that cutout on the front and then the cutout on the back for the back of the neck. And it will be cut on the fold to make one giant triangle, and it will be cut on the fold along the top. Now this pattern piece was not perfect, and I did actually have to make an adjustment, which you'll see later. And of course, a pocket that fits a wand. I decided this one was too small and I made it even longer, so they're the world's longest pockets. Laying out all of my pattern pieces, you can see that 5 yards is more than enough, but it gave me extra in case I needed to recut any pattern pieces for mistakes, which definitely happened. Sides of this fabric were just very slightly different, and with French seams you really need to know what's the wrong and the right side, so I wrote inside on the inside of the garment to not make mistakes. The front sides and the back were attached together with wrong sides together first, which is how you start a French seam. At this point, I wanted to do the first fitting, now that the sides were sewn up, to make sure that it was looking okay and at least fit around me. And it was looking okay. Definitely not super baggy on top, which is what I wanted. And it definitely overlapped in the front, which was good. And the length was okay, so I thought it was okay to move on from this point. And I didn't have enough fabric to recut, even if it was bad, so I really don't, like, the fitting didn't really do anything. But I did get to pick where I wanted my pockets to start, which is more helpful when you have it on. I assembled the pockets with a French seam as well, so those just get sewn together with the seam. You then iron it and trim down that seam allowance. You flip it inside out, iron, then sew another seam to encase the raw edges. I marked where I needed to seam rip on either side in order to insert the pocket. I then prepared the rest of the seam for the second part of the French seam by ironing and trimming it down and cleaning up all of the mess. And I also like to pin before sewing the second seam of a French seam, just to make sure everything is where it should be when you're sewing. The pocket is then pinned into the place that I seam rip, and you have to make sure that you turn the pocket inside out first, which I definitely forgot and had to redo both pockets, which was such a pain. Then you just sew along that seam where we just pinned, making sure to stop right before the pocket and do a little back stitch to hold that in place, and then start again after the pocket, and that will finish up the whole long side seam and just leave the pocket opening. Lastly, you just sew up both sides of the pocket opening and also zigzag stitch the ends to keep them from fraying, because these are not finished by a French seam. And then all that's left is to just iron the absolute heck out of that pocket opening in all conceivable ways so that it lies nice and flat and basically invisible when you have the robe on and it's nice and flowy. The shoulder seams were then attached, and these also needed to be French seams as the facing will not cover them and there is no lining to cover the raw edges. The hood is sewn together before attaching, and don't forget to turn out that point nice and sharp. Then you want to match up the middle of the hood to the middle of the back and start attaching from the center out down to the sides. Then it was time for another try on to make sure that I wasn't making any huge mistakes and that I was attaching this on in the right way. And it's looking pretty good. It's looking like a hood. It's got that nice sort of collar effect going on. The hood is then just sewn on with a simple normal seam that doesn't need to be finished because it will be covered with the facing. Speaking of the facing, it's time to cut that out. Using the same hood pattern, you cut it out but with a long 5-inch strip leading down 50 inches of length. Also, I did not cut this hood on the fold, so it does have 2 seams in it. The edges of the robe is then pinned right sides together to the facing, starting at the very top of the hood and then going down each side. Then just simply stitch all the way around from end to end. With the facing attached, all you do is turn the facing to the inside and then iron it a million different ways and pin until you want to die with all of the pins. I probably should have basted it actually. It would have been faster, especially with all of my sleeve troubles that are coming, but I'm a stickler for pins, I guess. Try on time. This is where it became clear that I wasn't happy with how little collar overhang there was, and I could also barely pull the hood onto my head. So I had to have a rethink of the hood pattern. I realized I needed to exaggerate the lapel part, that triangle part that comes off of the hood. And by doing this, it will also make the hood deeper, which will allow me to actually pull it onto my head. So this is how I amended my pattern piece. I also will admit that I thought I could still use the same facing, so I only seam drifted off of the hood section before reattaching the new hood and then sewing the old facing back to the new hood. So I did all of that. And then realized that obviously I need a new facing because the facing is created using the hood, so you can't cover up, like you see, it doesn't work. So I had to redo that, and that meant seam ripping the facing all the way out, cutting out a new one, putting it together, and ironing and pinning it in again until I died. But I was much happier with how it looked after doing that. I almost didn't do this before moving on to the sleeves, and I'm so glad that I did because it was so much better, and I could put the hood on and it just matched much more what I wanted. For the sleeves, I also marked to the inside to not get confused, but somehow I still ended up with 2 left sleeves in the wool fabric and a right and a left in the lining fabric. At least it was a quick fix at this point, just a nice seam rip. Making sure that the right sides are touching when you slide one into the other, I pinned around the hand end of the sleeve. Once this was pinned in place, I stitched around the sleeve to get a finished off edge around the hand first. This needed some creative ironing and use of the tailor's ham to get this nice and pressed out. I pinned the top layers of the sleeve together to keep them from shifting while attaching. Now the actual insertion of these sleeves was my Everest, my nemesis. The armscye hole was bigger than this top of the sleeve, which is not good. The most important tip I can give you is that you should always baste in the sleeve with the largest stitch on your machine for easy removal, which I did probably over 20 times. First try left the sleeve hanging funny is the only way I can describe. It felt almost restricting, but I could tell I needed to rotate the sleeve about an inch towards the back. So that was the first change I made. I just literally took the whole thing out, rotated it forward an inch, or towards the back an inch, and that fixed. The sleeve is actually hanging in the right spot, but I just wasn't happy with the sort of pleat I had to make in the back because the armscye was too big in the garment and the sleeve was too small at the top. So now proceeds me just making change after change after change, and finally I got to a place where I was sort of happy with it. This is what I landed on. You can see that I've changed into pajamas to show that time has passed. This took like a whole evening, and the back was laying a lot better. I tucked the pleat farther under the arm so that it's sort of hidden. On the front side, I had to sew with a huge seam allowance to get rid of the excess that was on the front panel, and sew with a small seam allowance on the back side because it was tight across my back, especially with other layers on underneath it. But I only had to do all that work on one side because then I just matched it on the other side when sewing in the second sleeve. So one sleeve was sewn in about 20 times and the other side just once. Now that we're nearing the end, let's talk about seam finishes. The French seams are all done. So the facing was stitched around the hood with smaller stitches to keep that in place, and the raw edge is just turned under. And it's also covering the raw edge of the wool fabric as well, so it's doing double duty. Then the long edges of the facing are tacked down in sort of huge stitches, going all the way down to the bottom. And I tried to keep these super invisible on the front, so taking a tiny stitch on the front and then taking probably like, oh god, I don't even know, like a 1/2 inch stitch down to hold it in place. Initially, I was going to flat fell the arm seams towards the bottom of the arm because there's a lining there to sew to, but it was just so bulky that I decided to finish them off with pre-made bias tape that I had lying around from my stays project. This meant I had to majorly trim down the seam, and then I machine stitched on the first side going down the bias tape. Then I turned over the bias tape to the other side and I hand stitched the second side in place. To get the button placement right, I looked at some reference photos and I tried it on and pinned the buttons in place until I got them where I wanted to. And I made sure when I took it off that I used the end of the hood seam as a reference to make sure that they were perfectly matched up on either side. And I'm just using a hair tie right now to hold them together. And of course, the last big thing to do is the hem, which I always hate. This robe was already shorter than I wanted, so it really hurt me that I knew I was gonna have to cut off extra fabric, but no one wants an uneven hem, so it had to be done. It was the shortest in the front center, and then the sides went longer. I used this photo as reference that it really should be the same length all the way around. And my first pinning job went actually shockingly good. So all that was left was to trim down and actually cut off that precious fabric, and then it just needed to be folded over twice, ironed and pinned in place, and then I just whip stitched the whole hem with pretty close together stitches for me, probably 8 an inch or so to keep the hem nice and flat. For the Gryffindor badge, I salvaged this one off of a sweater that really shouldn't have it to begin with because the sweaters don't have the badge, the hood does. And with that, it's complete. I'm overall happy with it. The sleeves could have been bigger and the length could have been closer to the floor, but with no mock-up, I think I did pretty good. Hopefully you find this useful if you're looking for a Halloween costume or maybe just a practical Gryffindor robe for your everyday life. And don't forget that trans witches are witches and JK Rowling is the scum of the earth.